In 1945, 51 nations founded the United Nations with a vision of global peace and cooperation. Today, 193 member states struggle with its effectiveness. As BRICS nations challenge the status quo, is the UN facing its most significant crisis since its inception? The United Nations was established with the primary objective of maintaining international peace and security, fostering cooperation among nations, and promoting social progress and human rights. Its structure, centered around the General Assembly and the Security Council, was designed to facilitate global dialogue and decision-making. However, growing dissatisfaction among member states, particularly BRICS nations, has emerged as a significant challenge to the UN's authority and effectiveness. The structure of the UN Security Council, with its 5 permanent members wielding veto power, has become a focal point of contention. This power imbalance has led to increasing calls for reform and restructuring of the organization. As we explore specific cases of country dissatisfaction and demands for change, it becomes evident that the UN's ability to adapt to the evolving global landscape will determine its relevance in the 21st century. 2. BRICS nations, challenging the status quo. As calls for change intensify, a new coalition of nations is emerging as a counterweight to traditional Western influence. The BRICS countries, with their rapidly growing economies and increasing political clout, are pushing for reforms that could redefine the balance of power in international institutions. How are these nations leveraging their collective strength to challenge the status quo? The BRICS nations, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represent a formidable economic and political force on the global stage. With a combined population of over 3 billion people and a collective GDP of approximately $26 trillion, these countries have become increasingly vocal about their dissatisfaction with the current structure of international organizations, particularly the United Nations. At the heart of BRICS nations' criticisms lies the issue of representation within the UN Security Council. The current structure, with 5 permanent members holding veto power, is seen as outdated and unrepresentative of the modern global landscape. BRICS countries argue that this arrangement perpetuates a Western-centric approach to global governance, often failing to adequately address the concerns and interests of developing nations. To address these perceived imbalances, BRICS nations have proposed several key reforms. Chief among these is the expansion of the UN Security Council to include more permanent members, potentially including representatives from Africa, Latin America, and other underrepresented regions. This proposal aims to create a more diverse and inclusive decision-making body that better reflects the current geopolitical reality. Additionally, BRICS countries are advocating for increased transparency within the UN Secretariat and a more merit-based appointment system. These reforms seek to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization while promoting gender balance and equitable representation across all levels of the UN structure. The call for reform extends beyond the United Nations to other international financial institutions. BRICS nations are pushing for greater representation and voting rights in organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. They argue that the current allocation of voting power does not accurately reflect the economic weight of emerging economies, leading to policies that may not fully consider the needs of developing nations. 3. Case studies. Indonesia and the Philippines. The push for UN reform isn't a recent phenomenon. In 1965, Indonesia made a bold move that shocked the international community. This decision, driven by complex political and ideological factors, set a precedent for expressing dissatisfaction with the United Nations structure and operations. Indonesia's temporary withdrawal from the UN in 1965 was primarily rooted in its opposition to the organization's perceived Western bias and its support for the newly formed Malaysia. This action came during a period of intense nationalism and anti-Western sentiment in Indonesia, led by President Sukarno. The country's leadership viewed the UN's stance on regional issues, particularly the formation of Malaysia, as an infringement on Indonesia's interests and a reflection of Western dominance in global affairs. The withdrawal had significant long-term implications for Indonesia's relationship with the UN and its role in global politics. While Indonesia eventually rejoined the organization, the incident highlighted the challenges faced by developing nations in navigating the complex landscape of international relations. It also underscored the growing tensions between newly independent states and the established global order represented by institutions like the UN. Decades later, another Southeast Asian nation, the Philippines, would echo similar sentiments of discontent with the United Nations. Under President Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines threatened to leave the UN, citing dissatisfaction with its operations and specific grievances. These included perceived neglect of human rights issues and inadequate support for developing nations. The Philippine government's stance reflected a growing frustration with what it saw as the UN's inability to address the unique challenges faced by countries in the global south. While Indonesia's withdrawal and the Philippines' threats occurred in different historical contexts, they share common themes of dissatisfaction with the UN's structure and operations. Both cases highlight a perception among some member states that the UN fails to adequately represent their interests or address their specific concerns. This sentiment is particularly prevalent among developing nations, who often feel marginalized in global decision-making processes. 4. The UN's challenges in the 21st century. The UN's shortcomings extend beyond representation issues. In an era of unprecedented global challenges, the organization's ability to respond effectively has come under scrutiny. How has the UN's performance in addressing modern crises exposed its limitations? And what are the implications for global stability? The United Nations faces significant challenges in the 21st century, with its effectiveness in addressing contemporary global issues increasingly questioned. One of the most pressing concerns is the organization's ability to respond to conflicts and maintain peace in volatile regions. Recent examples, such as the ongoing war in Ukraine and the unrest in Sudan, have highlighted the limitations of UN peacekeeping efforts. The Security Council, hampered by geopolitical divisions between Western countries and powers like Russia and China, has struggled to react decisively to these crises. This sluggish response has raised doubts about the UN's capacity to fulfill its primary mandate of maintaining international peace and security. Climate change presents another critical challenge for the UN. Despite some progress, such as the establishment of a loss and damage fund to support vulnerable nations, significant gaps remain in both funding and implementation of climate action plans. Developing countries face considerable obstacles in securing the resources needed to cope with the severe impacts of climate change, exacerbating global inequalities. The UN's ability to mobilize global action on this existential threat remains a pressing concern, with the need for urgent and coordinated efforts becoming increasingly apparent. The UN's progress towards its Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, is also falling behind schedule. With only a fraction of the targets likely to be met by 2030, the organization faces a daunting task in addressing poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation. The lack of sufficient resources and slow progress in these areas underscore the challenges the UN faces in achieving its ambitious global development agenda. This shortfall raises questions about the organization's ability to drive meaningful change and improve living conditions for people worldwide. Humanitarian crises represent another area where the UN's limitations are evident. Currently, over 180 million people across 72 countries are in need of assistance. The UN's capacity to address these crises is constrained by limited resources, and its responses are often insufficient in areas affected by protracted conflicts such as Yemen and South Sudan. Political divisions and logistical difficulties continue to impede rapid and coordinated action, highlighting the need for more effective humanitarian interventions. 5. Reform proposals and their implications. As the UN grapples with financial constraints, a new wave of reform proposals emerges on the global stage. The G20, under Brazil's leadership, has agreed to advocate for major changes to institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization, and international financial organizations. This movement marks a significant evolution in the global push for institutional reform, extending beyond the initial calls from BRICS nations to a broader consensus among developed and developing countries alike. At the forefront of these proposals is the expansion of the UN Security Council. The G20's reform agenda emphasizes the need for better representation of underrepresented and unrepresented regions and groups. This proposal aims to address long-standing criticisms of the Security Council's structure, which has remained largely unchanged since the UN's inception. By including more diverse voices in this critical decision-making body, reformers hope to enhance the UN's legitimacy and effectiveness in addressing global challenges. Another key area of focus is the reform of the UN Secretariat. The G20 is pushing for changes that would promote greater transparency, equitable geographic distribution, merit-based appointments, and gender balance within the organization. These reforms seek to modernize the UN's internal structure and operations, potentially improving its efficiency and responsiveness to global issues. The World Trade Organization, WTO, is also a target for significant reform. The G20's proposals aim to strengthen the WTO's capacity to resolve trade disputes and position it as a key engine for global economic growth and prosperity. This focus on reforming international trade mechanisms reflects a growing recognition of the need for more equitable and efficient global economic governance. While these reform proposals are ambitious in scope, it's important to note that a concrete timeline for implementation has yet to be established. The complexity of these reforms and the need for broad consensus among member states suggest that discussions will be ongoing and potentially challenging. The overarching objective of these proposed changes is to align global governance structures with contemporary realities, addressing challenges such as climate change, poverty, and geopolitical instability. The potential implications of these reforms are far-reaching. If implemented, they could lead to a significant shift in global power dynamics. Expanding the Security Council and reforming the UN Secretariat could result in a more diverse and representative decision-making process on critical international issues. This could potentially lead to more balanced and inclusive global policies, addressing concerns of bias and underrepresentation that have long plagued the organization. Reforms to the WTO and international financial institutions could have profound effects on global trade and economic development. By strengthening dispute resolution mechanisms and promoting more equitable participation, these changes might foster a more stable and fair global economic environment. This could be particularly beneficial for developing nations, which have often felt marginalized in current global economic structures. However, the implementation of these reforms also presents significant challenges. Balancing the interests of various member states, particularly those of current Permanent Security Council members, will require delicate diplomacy and potential compromise. There's also the risk that major structural changes could temporarily disrupt the functioning of these institutions, potentially leading to periods of increased global instability during the transition. Moreover, the success of these reforms will largely depend on the willingness of powerful nations to cede some of their current influence in favor of a more equitable global order. This may prove to be a significant hurdle, as countries are often reluctant to relinquish established positions of power and influence. 6. The road ahead. Balancing reform and stability. The United Nations stands at a critical juncture, facing mounting pressure to reform its structure and operations. As calls for change intensify, the organization grapples with a fundamental challenge: how to transform itself to meet 21st century challenges while maintaining global stability. This dilemma encapsulates the complex balancing act required to modernize an institution established in the aftermath of World War II, without undermining its foundational role in international relations. The implementation of UN reforms presents a formidable task, given the diverse interests of its 193 member states and the need for broad consensus. The expansion of the Security Council, a key proposal championed by the G20 under Brazil's leadership, illustrates the intricacies of this process. While there is growing recognition of the need for better representation of underrepresented regions, the specifics of such an expansion, including which countries might gain permanent seats and whether new members would have veto power, remain contentious issues. The potential risks and benefits of major structural changes to the UN are significant. On one hand, reforms could lead to a more representative and effective global governance system, better equipped to address contemporary challenges such as climate change, economic inequality, and regional conflicts. On the other hand, the transition period could witness increased global instability as power dynamics shift and established norms are redefined. The delicate balance of power maintained by the current structure, despite its flaws, has contributed to preventing large-scale conflicts between major powers since the UN's inception. Middle powers and regional organizations are poised to play a crucial role in shaping the future of global governance. These entities, often more nimble and less encumbered by the geopolitical baggage of great powers, can serve as bridges between competing interests and catalysts for pragmatic solutions. Regional organizations like the African Union, ASEAN, and the European Union may increasingly take on responsibilities traditionally within the UN's purview, particularly in areas where the UN has struggled to act effectively. The potential for alternative scenarios of global cooperation looms large if UN reforms fail to materialize or prove ineffective. One possibility is the emergence of a more fragmented international system, with regional blocs and ad hoc coalitions taking precedence over global institutions. This could lead to a patchwork of overlapping and potentially competing frameworks for addressing transnational issues, potentially undermining the cohesive global approach needed to tackle challenges like climate change and pandemics. The United Nations faces unprecedented challenges in the 21st century, with growing calls for reform from BRICS nations and other member states. These demands for change reflect a broader dissatisfaction with the current global governance structure, which many view as outdated and unrepresentative of contemporary geopolitical realities. The G20's endorsement of reforms to institutions like the UN signals a significant shift in global consensus, highlighting the urgency of addressing these issues. As the international community grapples with reshaping post-World War II institutions, this moment represents a critical juncture in global governance. The potential for a new era of global cooperation hinges on the ability to implement meaningful reforms within the UN framework. However, this process must balance the need for change against the risks of destabilizing existing global order. The success or failure of these reform efforts will likely have profound implications for international relations and the UN's future relevance in addressing global challenges.